Today on our Gospel Truth broadcast, I'm continuing to teach about how to let God's love flow through you to other people. And today we're going to talk about if there is a problem, you've got to diagnose what the source of that problem is. It could be you, could be other person, could be both of you, it could be God. Stay tuned for the Gospel Truth.
Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that emphasizes God's unconditional love and grace. And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Monday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing a series that I started 2 weeks ago. This is actually the beginning of my third week, and I'm teaching on God's kind of love through you. This is a follow-up to a teaching that I did last summer entitled God's Kind of Love to You, talking about God's unconditional love for you personally. Now we're talking about how you can let this God kind of love flow through you to other people. And we're now into our fourth teaching in this segment. I've got a new album out entitled God's Kind of Love Through You. There's 9 parts to it, and this is the beginning of the fourth teaching in that 9-part set. And we've already covered a lot of material. I talked about how important it is to understand loving other people, how it's a foundational truth. Jesus said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples," so we talked about that. I also talked about how that you need to realize that you can't get along with everyone. Now, I'm going to, especially on our programs beginning today, we're going to get into the meat of this teaching about how to get along and how to reconcile with other people, and we're going to be putting an emphasis on that. But you need to recognize that you just can't get along with every single person. And so there needs to be a realistic expectation. We can certainly improve our relationships with other people, but there isn't any way that you can just make everyone love you and walk in love with you. It's not going to happen that way. So we talked about that, and then on our programs last week, I ended with talking about before you can fix the problem, you have to accurately diagnose what the root of the problem is. And basically, the only thing I really talked about last week was, are you the problem? I gave 4 potential reasons why people have trouble. One of them is it you. The other one is it them. The third one is it both of you. And then the fourth one I'm going to save because I'll be dealing with that this week, and it may surprise you. But we talked first of all about is it you and about you not rushing to judgment. We used Matthew chapter 7 verses 1 through 4. So now today what I want to begin to do is to talk about are you the problem? Or excuse me, not are you the problem. Is the other person the problem? We've already covered are you the problem. If the other person is the problem, how do you respond? What do you do? Well, let me share a scripture with you out of Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. It says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." And there's a number of other scriptures that I could bring to bear that say this exact same thing. But notice that it says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth within you, live peaceably with all men." Again, this goes back to a point that I've already covered before, but you just cannot make everyone love you. And so if it's not you, now if you're the problem, well, you have 100% control over that. You can change, you can repent, you can go and ask forgiveness. There's lots of things you can do. But if the other person is really the cause of the strife and the division, and this happens. I mean, there's people that treat you badly. And you know what? There are times that you literally cannot reconcile with other people. And that's what this verse is talking about. If it's possible, in other words, it's not always possible, as much as lieth within you. In other words, you just simply cannot make every single person reconcile to you. So when you're trying to diagnose, what's the root of this problem? If the other person is the problem, well then part of that diagnosis is there anything that you can do about it? If the other person is the problem. And right now, we're talking about the diagnosis stage, not about the treatment stage. That's going to be our next teaching, is when we start talking about, all right, if the other person is the problem, how do you deal with it? I'm not going to get into that right now. But I'm just saying that you need to understand that sometimes it can be the other person, and you don't have a single thing to do with it. Other people sometimes treat you poorly. You know, I see this happen a lot with me, that there's people who watch my teaching on television or get a tape or CD or something like that, and they get offended, and they write into me, and they're offended, and they're mad, and they're upset, and most of the time, I just have to let it go. Because for one thing, the communication through a letter or through an email or something like that, that's not the best way to try and resolve something. And in most cases, you know, people are coming, they hear just a little tiny portion of something that I'm saying, and they immediately jump to a conclusion. I've had people say, boy, you're just like, you know, this pastor that I grew up under, and they immediately impute to me, transfer over to me all of the things that somebody else has done because maybe I used the same phrase that they did or something like that. If they rush and jump to a judgment like that, you know, most of the time there's really not much that you can do about that. Plus, I get so many letters where people are criticizing me that, you know, I just simply could spend all of my time trying to reconcile and deal with things. But every once in a while, somebody will say something, and I can just perceive in their tone that they're sincere, that they mean well, and for whatever reason, they've just totally misread something. And as much as lies within me, when I see that there's an opportunity to reconcile with this person, I'll do something. I'll write them back. I remember one time that a guy wrote in, and I can't even remember what it was that I said, but he immediately put me into the category of some of these preachers that, you know, live in these multi-million-dollar homes and drive the fancy cars and fleece the people, and he was judging me, and he was very critical, and in his letter he demanded that I tell him what my income was, and he demanded that I tell him what kind of cars that I drove and what kind of house that I lived in and things like this. And he was really offensive. And normally I wouldn't respond to that, but I just felt in my heart that, you know, I don't know why, I just felt like that I needed to respond to him. So anyway, at the time, this has been a long time ago, and we were in between a house that we had lived in. We were trying to build our own house, and we actually were living in a rental house that we thought we would just be in for a couple of months. It turned out we were there for 2 years, and it was a dog. It was really bad. It was a terrible house. So anyway, all of the stats in my life at that time were certainly not living extravagantly or anything. So I responded to this guy, and the way I responded was to say, first of all, I believe that you're totally unjust in the demands that you've made. You know, like for instance, I wouldn't sit there and demand from you what your income is. I wouldn't demand to know what kind of house you lived in and how much your payments were. I wouldn't demand to know what kind of car you drive. I said, first of all, it's none of my business. And I said, you just don't have the right to demand any of these things. I said, you just listen to the Lord, and if God tells you to support us, support us. If He doesn't, don't. So I approached him that way, but then I said, you know what, I will tell you exactly all these things. And I gave him how much our income was, that we were living in a rent house that was like $400 a month, and the ceiling was falling in at the time. Now again, that's not the standard that I live at, but I'm just saying that that was the situation at that time. I was driving about a 15-year-old car that my mother had given me, and we were in between some things, and anyway, I just responded and gave this guy this information. And, you know, it turned out that that guy humbled himself, wrote in, and he apologized, and he says, you know, I have always had a problem with this. And he humbled himself, and that guy became a partner with us. I don't know if he still is or not. But I'm saying that you have to be able to discern when you see this thing, this strife or a potential problem between you and somebody else. You need to know, is there a legitimate problem? Did you cause this problem? Are you the source of it? Or a second option is, sometimes it's just the other person that has a problem. And it depends on how deep-seated it is. It depends on whether there is any opportunity for you to change that. And really, just like I was giving that example, you need to be led by the Lord to be able to understand whether you can do anything about it. Let me share another scripture with you out of Proverbs chapter 18, and I believe that this fits the situation that I'm talking about. Proverbs chapter 18, and in verse 24, it says, a man that hath friends must show himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Now, typically, we'll use that in a first-person thing about, you know, if you want to have friends, you've got to be friendly to other people. But the same thing is true of other people. There are some people that, honestly, the reason they don't have friends, it's not because people don't desire to be friendly to them and to have relationships, but they just have so many problems that you can't get close to them. And when you discern a problem between you and another person, this is one of the options that sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That for you to be friendly to a person, they have to show themselves friendly. They have to be open to it. And you need to recognize that sometimes you just simply cannot overcome some of the ways that people act. And you need to be able to discern, is it my fault or is it their fault? And if it's their fault, sometimes you just simply cannot get along with them. Now, I am making this one of the options, and I am emphasizing that this is a potential problem, but you know what? I think it's most of the time we just assume that it's always the other person. I spent a long period of time. I spent days talking about, is it me? Because I believe that that's probably a more viable option. We sometimes are quick to pull this little tiny speck out of another person's eye, and we got this huge beam coming out of our own eye. But it is true that sometimes the other person is the problem, and you need to be honest enough and not give in to condemnation to where you just always assume that there must be something about me. Sometimes the other person is the problem. Now, I've got a lot more to share about this, but we are going to be taking a break right here. I would like to encourage you to please get these materials. The kind of things that we're talking about here are really practical. They're going to help you in your relationships with other people. So I encourage you to please get these materials. We're offering the album and this individual teaching that's entitled, If Not Me, Then Who? So if you'll listen, our announcer will give you that information. I encourage you to call or write today, and then I'll be right back after this break to continue the gospel truth.
Andrew's 9-part teaching titled God's Kind of Love Through You is available on CD for a gift of £30 or more. The fourth individual CD in the album is available for a donation of £3. But to those unable to send a gift, Andrew and his partners will provide this fourth CD free of charge. Or you can receive the full album as part of the God's Kind of Love 5-pack for a gift of £60 or more. The 5-pack includes God's Kind of Love Through You, God's Kind of Love To You, and God's Kind of Love, The Cure for What Ails You. 2 companion books complete the 5-pack, The True Nature of God and Spirit, Soul, and Body. Request the God's Kind of Love 5-pack when you write, call, or go to our website. We hope to hear from you today. And now, Gospel Truth continues.
So we're talking about how to let God's love flow through you to other people. If there's been some kind of an offense, if there is some division between you and another person, you have to diagnose what is the cause of this problem. Is it you? Or what we've been talking about before our break today is it the other person? And sometimes it is the other person, and there is nothing that you have done that has occasioned it, and you need to be secure enough to be able to make that decision. You know, it seems like personality types. There are some people that just always refuse to accept any responsibility whatsoever. They are quick to judge everybody else, that it's always somebody else's fault. And there are some people it seems like that's just their bent. And then there's other people, I'm one of these, and I don't know what the reason for it is. I'm just telling you, I've seen this in myself and I see it in other people, that I'm quick to always feel like I must have done something wrong. You're quick to feel condemnation. I actually would suspect, based on my background, that it's because I was raised in a religious system where condemnation was preached. And anyway, I just have had a bent towards every time something happens, immediately I think it must be my fault. Well, you know what? You can get into a ditch on either side of that issue. It's not always the other person, and it's not always you. Sometimes you are the problem, and if it is, you need to deal with that and be honest, but sometimes you need to be honest enough to recognize that, hey, I didn't do anything here. The other person took an offense when none was intended. And there are people, I'm sure, watching this program right now that you have erred on this side, that you always get condemned. You know, I deal with this a lot in parents. Parents just think that if they do what's right with their kid, that that kid will always, always respond to them in a certain way. And so if the kid's doing anything wrong, the parent just feels responsible for it. And again, there's a balance in this. I do believe that parents have a huge, huge influence over your kids. But you know, there's a lot of times that I have to tell parents that, you know what, you are letting this kid manipulate you and control you, because they perceive that you are taking personal responsibility for everything that they're doing. You're condemned about it, and so they manipulate and they use that. Kids are smart and they understand what's going on. And there's a lot of parents that I've had to tell that, you know what, you just need to do what's right. And regardless of what their response is, you cannot take responsibility always for their response. I was talking to a woman just this last week whose husband did some terrible, terrible things, and she, according to Scriptures, has, you know, the right to divorce. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing, and it's not the first time that it's come along. And so anyway, they were asking me about it, and she says, but I'm so concerned about what he will do. What will he do? And I said, you know what, you need to do what's right. You need to do what God leads you to do and not let somebody else hold you hostage. There are times that you just need to recognize you cannot control other people. I tell you, if you live, and I have lived this way, it's the reason I'm being so strong on saying this, to where you just assume that if anything's wrong, it must be something that you've done. That's torment. You can't live that way. You've got to recognize that sometimes the other person is just being a pain, and there is not a single thing that you can do about it. And this is part of the diagnosis of the situation. You need to consider this as an option. Now again, I'm cautious to say that because there's going to be some of you that'll just immediately say, well, yeah, that's it, and you don't consider it, that you could be a part of the problem. There's a balance. But if you would just open up your heart and be sensitive, sometimes the Lord is going to tell you that there's nothing you can do. The other person is the problem. Here's the third option when you have problems between you and another person, and that is it both of you? And you know, I believe that this is probably usually the answer to the situation. This is the proper diagnosis. In most situations that I deal with, one person does something and they may not have even intended it. It might have been just neglect. It might have been, you know, unintentional. But then because you were hurt, you respond back and you criticize or say something, and then they get hurt, and it becomes one of these things where you're both at fault in the relationship. And I believe that this is more often than not what the problem is. And again, that has a different solution to it. If you discern that both of you are the problem, there's going to be a different solution. But you need to be able to properly diagnose. Is it me? Is it them? Or is it both of us? And I tell you, this is really important that you consider this and recognize your part. Now, I'm going to come back to this when we talk about what the solution is to that. And this has a unique solution if both of you are at fault. There are some really unique things that you do to solve that situation. And here's a fourth option. Now, this is important, and this is going to blindside some of you. You've never considered this. But you know, it could be God that is causing a separation between you and this other person. Now again, I don't believe that God is the author of division. I believe that God's best is for us to walk in love with every single person. But there are relationships that are toxic. There are relationships that are bad for you. And there's many, many scriptures I could use on this. Let me just turn over and use one out of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and I think this will make my point. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, he says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial, or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Now these scriptures make it very clear that the Lord's telling you to withdraw, separate yourself from certain situations, certain relationships. Now again, I believe that in a perfect world, God would want us to be in love with every person. But you know what? There are some people who have literally given themselves over to Satan. They have committed their life to that. They are antagonistic towards the gospel, towards everything that's good. And like it says over in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, it says, "Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners." You know what? You're deceived if you think that you can go around people who hate everything that you stand for, everything that your relationship with God stands for. And if you can just dwell among those people, you're deceived if you think you can do that without it corrupting your good manners. The Scripture makes it very clear that there is a right time to separate. Now, I am not preaching that we go live in a monastery and that you try and shut the world out. We are the salt of the earth. And if we don't ever get out of the salt shaker, you aren't ever going to have an influence. And I really believe that, again, there's a balance to everything that I'm saying. You could get over here to where you're so afraid that you won't even talk to a person who's not a fanatical Christian because you're afraid that you'll be tainted by those kind of things. That's not what I'm talking about. I believe that Christians ought to be friendly and kind and loving towards the unbelievers, that you ought to reach out. I believe that we ought to have people that we influence, and there ought to be some fellowship and relationship, but it needs to be in a controlled way. Really, it boils down to, are you influencing this unbeliever, or is this unbeliever influencing you? You basically could evaluate whether or not it's a healthy relationship by who's the one that's in control, who's the one that's in the position of leadership in this relationship. And if you're around people that their influence over you is greater than your influence over them, then according to these scriptures, there are times that God is going to say, come out from among them. Be separate. Don't touch these things. I can give you a scriptural example. I don't have time on today's program, but as we go through this, I'll be giving some scriptural example where the Apostle Paul separated the disciples because people were openly criticizing and speaking against the teaching that he was doing. And so he took the disciples and separated them out of that synagogue and put them in a position to where they could grow under a positive ministry instead of all of this strife and all of this division. You know, there are some times that God will put an end to a relationship. Now again, you could misuse what I'm saying. There's some people that just because there's any problem, you just blow it off and say, well, this is God putting an end to it. You need to be careful, but I'm saying that this is an option. I could give you testimonies right now of relationships that I've had with people that I tried to force and to make work, and they just wouldn't work. And we wound up going our separate ways, not hating each other or anything like that, but just not continuing along the lines that we were. And in retrospect, I can look back and see that, you know what, it was a real blessing that happened because this other individual got into some problems, and they were the one that was in the leadership in this relationship, and they would have influenced me, and there's very good possibility that I would have followed in those steps. I can see that God is the one that put an end to these relationships. So we've been talking about how to get along with people and how to let God's love flow through you. You've got to analyze, is it me that's the problem? Is it them? Is it them that's the problem? Is it both of us that's the problem? Or is possibly God the one that's putting an end to this relationship? And depending on how you diagnose what is the cause of this division, then that's going to determine how you respond to it. So this is really important, the things that we're talking about right here. And I tell you, I encourage you to pray about it, and I believe it'll always be one of those four things right there. And if you would deal with this, I believe that you can begin to start letting God's kind of love flow through you to other people. Now, I'm going to continue this on our program tomorrow, so I encourage you to listen in then. And also, if you would listen, our announcer is going to give you information about how you can get this teaching either in the entire album or this individual teaching that we've covered today.
Andrew's 9-part teaching titled God's Kind of Love Through You is available on CD for a gift of £30 or more. The 4th individual CD and the album is available for a donation of £3. But to those unable to send a gift, Andrew and his partners will provide this 4th CD free of charge. Our address is AWME. That's Andrew Wommack Ministries of Europe, P.O. Box 4392, Walsall, WS1 9AR, England. Our telephone number is 01922 473 300. When calling from outside the UK, you must dial your international calling code, then 44 1922 473 300. Or you can go to our website at any hour. You can use credit card to make donations and receive ministry products 24 hours a day at awme.net. Or you can receive the full album as part of the God's Kind of Love 5-pack for a gift of £60 or more. The 5-pack includes God's Kind of Love Through You, God's Kind of Love to You, and God's Kind of Love, the Cure for What Ails You. 2 companion books complete the 5-pack, The True Nature of God and Spirit, Soul, and Body. Request the God's Kind of Love 5-pack when you write, call, or go to our website. We hope to hear from you today.
I'd like to encourage you to visit our website. The address is on the screen, and I tell you, we have a tremendous website where we have about 8 years worth of our television, 10 years worth of radio. We've got books, we've got tapes. I've got about 300 to 400 of my teachings that are available as free downloads on MP3. It's a tremendous site, and it could really help you grow in the Lord. That's the reason that we've made everything on there free. It's a blessing to you, so please check it out. I believe that you would be tremendously blessed. It could become a resource that you and your friends could use.
If you are interested in coming and getting more in-depth training, and not only teaching about it, but practical experience where you go out and live it, see God's love for you in manifestation, and share it with other people, I encourage you to join us.
Gold nuggets flying by you all 4 hours of the day. Then you go home and you study those. You're just being transformed.
Religion's not an issue here. It's just the love of God and a relationship with God.
And it's not just the 4 hours a day in school, but it's outside of the classroom too. And when we get to rehearse that and go over the things that we've been learning in class and different revelation that somebody's got, I mean, it's almost 24 hours a day of being in the Word.
I encourage you to join us. Please call or write for information, the numbers that you see on your screen. Call or write today.
Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more gospel truth.
You know, the Scripture says in James chapter 3, verse 16, that where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. You should go in and share the gospel with other people. But you know what? If the reaction of those other people is strife, then eventually there comes a point to where you pressing the issue is going to be an inroad for the devil more than an inroad for God.